sit here, Margaret, and then Meg, and Ted will sit at the end. One thing I'll say to the panelists, I think it's been a really good year so far. The one criticism we've gotten is that people need to speak into the microphones, both for the live stream audience, but also so everyone can hear. So just keep that in mind. Margaret, let me start with you. I mean, it seems to me that in some ways, as Trump has moved more to the right, as Trump has emphasized his issues, the Democrats are moving more to the left, embracing identity politics, raising, I think, very profound questions. The New York Times in its 1619 series, the debate over reparations, the sort of debate about mass incarceration, kind of fundamental questions of identity and questions about American identity. And I'm wondering, from where you sit, having been involved in these issues, but then in a political context, how do we pull together the kind of need for historical accuracy and a moral reckoning with trying to bring a country together and trying to govern it?
That is the question of the day, and question of the evening, and the question of the day, and obviously the question of this election season. When the term identity politics is I think misunderstood or understood differently by people all across the country, and in some sense, it's seen as it's like political correctness or multiculturalism. It's seen as a bit of a curse, at least a curse to politicians who are trying to pull together winning coalitions, but. Identity politics really simply means that you cannot approach the American electorate without some profound consideration of the questions of identity that both make us the country we are and that have also divided us over the years. Identity politics is often cast in opposition to, say, class politics. And it's seen as kind of one or the other. And my view essentially is that you need both in order to form a winning coalition in the Trump era. Race and racism has been the hallmark of the Trump presidency. He has unleashed the dogs and allowed other politicians to abandon the dog whistle and just go straight out for the jugular on questions of race, all over the country. He's mobilized on those issues, and so it would be frightful to see the Democratic Party abandon any discussion of race and racism in this country in the interests of appeal to a white working class. That's often how it's put, that identity politics is going to be the third rail of the Democratic Party because white working class folks don't want to hear about race. Well, first of all, that's not been tested. Is there racial animus all across our country? Yes. Does that mean that you can't talk and chew gum at the same time? Talk both about race and identity and feminism and homophobia and Islamophobia in our country, while at the same time addressing issues of class that are so critically important to white, black, and brown people in this country who are in deep economic difficulties, deep economic straits, trying to support their families. So my view is that race has always been the agenda on the American political scene. Today we call it identity politics. We haven't had a president who's won a majority of white, a Democratic president who's won a majority of the white voters in this country since Lyndon Johnson. That hasn't changed. It didn't change to the Obama era. So there is increasing polarization, but that, to my view, that doesn't mean that one has to abandon the central role that race plays in structuring economically and in every other way our policies and our country. let me say one last thing, and then I'll turn it over to Ben, which is that where race and gender and religion and sexual identity are important to policies, they can't be ignored. So on the question of race, for example, you can't talk about criminal justice without talking about race and racism. You can't talk about voter politics. You can't talk about immigration without talking about race. You can't see those issues or fully understand those issues without talking about race, and without talking about race to the entire electorate, the way race shapes those questions. It is also true that where race doesn't matter, it shouldn't trump other it shouldn't distract us from talking it shouldn't narrow our focus on issues where race is not relevant to the policy questions that might be raised. So it's a thin line that candidates have to walk, but we've been doing this for a long time.
So, Ben, let me ask you, I mean, as we discussed, after the election in 2016, the media had kind of a collective nervous breakdown, trying to understand not so much what happened, but also how we all missed it. And if you could talk a little bit about your kind of personal reaction to that, where the book emerged, and then what your sense is of the people you spoke to, how they might reflect on some of these issues that Margaret raises, as well as their own concerns.
Well, like most people in the country, I was astonished that a candidate as unusual as Donald Trump got himself elected president and was looking for a different way to write about the Trump phenomenon. And I think most people after the election, and perhaps most today, are shocked that he won and wanted to know more about who voted for him and why. So looking for a different way to write about the Trump phenomenon, I examined the election returns in the three critical states that decided the election, that is Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And Trump unexpectedly won those states by a total of 77,000 odd votes out of 13 million cast. And going through the Pennsylvania vote, I discovered this county in northeast Pennsylvania where Wilkes-Barre is, called Luzerne County, just down the road from Scranton. And this is a traditionally Democratic county. It hadn't voted Republican since George Bush Sr. in 1988, and a strong Union county, and Obama had carried the county twice, but it surged in the other direction in 2016 for Trump, and he won it by 20 points and built up such a margin in this one county that it was 60% of his victory margin in the state of Pennsylvania. So without this one county, he wouldn't have won the state or perhaps the presidency, to the extent Michigan and Wisconsin have similar demographics. So within a month of the election, I decided to drive down there and begin interviewing Trump voters with a view to seeing whether this one county might serve as a microcosm to tell the Trump story writ large. And after interviewing about 100 voters, I decided to profile 12 of them who I thought represented a different cross-section of the Trump constituency. And if there was a common denominator, it was among them, it was that they all felt aggrieved and not listened to. And Trump came along and I don't think people vote for president on the issues largely. I think they vote on their gut. And this guy, even though he's a billionaire, found a way to relate to them on a gut level in a way that Hillary Clinton could not. And they felt that time had passed them by. They felt that the so-called elites on either coast looked down on them and condescended to them. They felt Hillary did. And so they decided to cast their lot with Trump. And some of them had voted for Obama. And as one state rep down there told me, Obama had hope and change. Trump had knocked down the door and change. And that's what these voters seem to be in a mood to do.
And the book came out in 2018?
Yes.
And so you stayed in touch with them. If you look at the Trump voters, what would you guess as you ended the book where they stood in regards to Trump? And what do you think now the breakdown would be?
Well, last I talked with them, I stay in touch with one or two of them almost daily. They send me stories on how great Trump is, and I try to send them more illuminating stories. And but last I talked with them as a group, of the 12, 11 said that if the election were held tomorrow, they'd be with Trump again, enthusiastically. Only one had slipped into the undecided category.
And to Margaret's suggestion that, we can walk and chew gum at the same time, how receptive do you think they would be to that, to an introduction of a discussion of race into the conversation? And this is always the question, are Trump voters racist? Are they secretly racist? Would they be open, or do they just shut down at that suggestion?
Yeah. Well, they're defensive about race, of course, and no one likes to be called a racist. And as Margaret said, race was buried within the immigration issue, certainly. And illegal immigration was Trump's issue. That's the one he rose to political prominence on. And that was a big issue for these all-white voters. And I think that it had to do with Trump's slogan, "Make America Great Again," tapped into a certain nostalgia that was appealing to them. And they remembered their days growing up in a more homogeneous society than Luzerne County is now, even though it's still predominantly white, perhaps 15% black and 15% Hispanic. I think these people just felt more comfortable in a more homogeneous society, and they look around today and they feel uncomfortable. And that was Trump's appeal, his "Make America Great Again" appeal. And they went with that.
Meg, let me ask you. Oh, sorry. Ted, did you want to say something? Or?
Yeah, there's some evidence that in the 2018 elections, there was some movement back towards the Democratic Party in Pennsylvania. Did that affect your county? And if so, what do you read into that?
It did affect the county. The incumbent Democratic senator and governor were reelected comfortably, and Pennsylvania picked up, I think, 4 or 5 House seats for Congress. So Trump, I did interpret that as a referendum on Trump to a certain extent. So I think there was definitely some slippage there. Although he would say, I wasn't on the ballot, and my people will come out next year. We'll see. And of course, impeachment has introduced a whole new variable, and I don't think we know how that's going to play politically yet.
Meg, so we've got race, class, now let's throw gender in to kind of make the stew even more complicated. There was a lot of talk, obviously, when Hillary Clinton ran about how she was portrayed, how she was seen by voters, and so forth. And those same issues are coming up, I think, with Elizabeth Warren and with Kamala Harris. And so I'm wondering how you look at that both from the way the media is covering things, but also the way the candidates are presenting themselves and the way voters are kind of receiving their message.
Absolutely. So Hillary Clinton as a case study is really complicated. Yes, she was the first woman nominated by a major political party, and she won the popular vote. And so there are many things about her that make her candidacy interesting and historically significant. But it is difficult to separate her gender from her Clintonness. She had just such a unique and unusual career trajectory. It's really difficult to draw any type of systematic analysis looking at just Hillary Clinton's campaign. That said, you can see in coverage of her candidacy, in the postmortems of her campaign, and in the coverage of even what she's been saying on Twitter since the impeachment inquiry opened up, you can see echoes of a long, persistent, and rather frustrating history of female candidates being framed in a more negative light than their male peers. And this is something that comes out of many decades of feminist scholarship in political science, in media studies, in journalism, in related fields. And one scholar tracked it back to the very first female presidential candidate who ran in the late 1800s. And what will generally happen is the terminology assigned to women will be more negative, will be more critical, or it will have nothing to do with policy procedures or how she might serve as a president and as a leader. It will be focused on physical appearance, on children, on spouse, on family. And, you can make some argument that when women first started running, there were maybe some questions. There was the novelty factor, and journalists love novelty. So there can be a little bit of wiggle room for that, I think. But at a certain point, the coverage for the male candidates became more about policy and demeanor and leadership, and it never really got there for women. Now we have come a good long way. So when in 1984, the Democratic Party, 84, selected Ferrara as running as the vice presidential nominee, there was this infamous, horrible column that was written, and I can't remember the columnist's name, and forgive me, this is very crass, but I think it makes a point. It said that Ferrara's legs, she had better legs than her counterpart on the Republican ticket, and she would be the first vice presidential candidate to ever win a wet t-shirt contest. And so this was 1984. This was a fairly accomplished elected official who had just been chosen as the Democratic Party's vice presidential nominee. Major historical event, and there was a columnist for a mainstream Midwest newspaper who was cracking jokes about her physical form and her ability to win a wet t-shirt contest. So we've come a long way, but we were starting from really, really low. And looking at current coverage of the female candidates running for the Democratic nomination, there are a lot of things that I'm paying attention to. First, this is the first time we've had an actual sample of women as opposed to just one woman. And the candidates who are running, all the candidates who are running on the Democratic ticket, they are very different in a whole lot of really interesting ways. And there's a lot of differentiation among the female candidates also. So I'm paying attention to how they are portrayed, how they're portraying themselves. I don't think it's an accident that Elizabeth Warren has a plan for everything, given the long history of the political media focusing so heavily on women's appearance and family life and personal life. You know, she really didn't give us a chance to do anything other than kind of scramble to follow these plans. And so I'm watching that quite a lot. And yeah.
So let me turn each of you into a kind of a consultant, if you were advising the candidates kind of on these areas that you've discussed. So Margaret, you know, if you were trying to advise the Democrats, I mean, it seems that Trump, the advice is pretty clear. Play to the base, just hope more of your people turn out in the important states and that you can win, just kind of stir the anger. What was that famous line from Ed King back in the day? We're going to throw all the hate groups into a pot and stir to a boil. But if you were advising, whether it was Joe Biden or Elizabeth Warren or Amy Klobuchar or Pete Buttigieg or any of them, on this question of trying to merge the issues of race and both kind of use them to unite people but also to address them, what would your strategy be from a political point of view? Or is that a bridge too far?
No, I mean, I would have a 3-point strategy, a 3-point plan. The first is to put the interests of working people first, whether black, brown, or white. Put the interests of working people first. The second is to see, as I said before, to see race where it's relevant to policy decisions. And the third is to call out the use of race by politicians who are using race or gender or homophobia to divide the electorate. That's my very simple 3-point plan.
So Ben, you had talked when we were talking in class with the students. You used the phrase the cult of Trump, and I think the question a lot of people have, especially in blue states, is, you know, how do you reach these people, or is that just not possible? And the alienation they feel and the grievance they have, is that alienation real? And is there some way the Democrats can appeal to that?
Well, I think they have to try, and I was saying in the class that I think would be money for a Democratic candidate to talk more about unifying the country again, or trying to get, how do we get this polarized country talking to each other again? Trump behaves as president only of his base and not of the entire country. He speaks only to his base. He makes no pretense about trying to unify the country. He's not a uniter, he's a divider. He starts each day tweeting that way and attacking and slashing. And I think the Democratic nominee would do well to think hard and talk about and show leadership on trying to, if not unify the country, it may be impossible, to at least talk about how we can better come together and how to bridge the divide and how to talk to each other. How to agree on, we should be able to agree on at least what facts were in this country. Now we can't even agree on what a fact is. And I would talk more about those kind of themes.
Do you think Warren has the ability to do that and could succeed, or Biden, or how would you look at the candidates that way? Starting with Warren, because she clearly is somebody who seems to be doing better and better every day.
Well, she is really improving as a candidate, as her standing in the polls shows. I don't hear her talking about unity as much as Biden is. That is a theme for Biden. And I think Amy Klobuchar as well has talked more about that. And she's got, Midwestern cred. Warren is I mean, she's a policy wonk, there's no question. I've got plans for that. And, her probably rooted in her Harvard background. She's a professor but I think she's improved so much as a candidate. She used to come across, I think, too much as a teacher, and but now she is much more relaxed in talking about her life story, which is compelling. And but I think she needs to find a way to get closer to the center. And I fear that if she's the nominee, she's just going to be seen as too left for the country.
Because of which issues?
Because of Medicare for all, and because of open borders, and she's stuck out there. And I think that Medicare for all is, I'm all for it, but I think it's, at this point, it should be more aspirational, because the country's just not there, and they definitely don't want, if they're lucky enough to have health insurance, they definitely don't want to have their health plan forcibly taken away from them. And that's a big, big thing that she's stuck on, I think, right now.
Meg, one of the surprises of 2016 was that we did have a breakthrough woman candidate running, and yet most women voters didn't vote for her. I think that was a question, and I think, and Ben talks about this in his book, is that the women in Luzerne County, despite all the stuff that Trump did, despite the Access Hollywood tape, despite Stormy Daniels, Ben said at one point he would push these women over and over again, and Trump seems to skate on that. So what does that say about gender? Is it that we're not talking about? We've had the Me Too movement. I mean, there seems to be, on the one hand, this kind of revolution and reexamination of the things that gender creates and the issues women have faced, and yet we have a president who seems locked in some kind of special bubble where nothing seems to touch him, even among women voters.
So white women, mostly upper middle class white women, have been enforcers of the white patriarchy in this country for centuries. And what we are seeing in what we saw in the results of the 2016 election, where I think it was like 55% of white women, 53% of white women voted for Trump, is the modern incarnation of that in a lot of ways. And white women, again, mostly upper middle class, but not exclusively, were very much involved in the creation of the modern conservative movement. There's a book called Mothers of Conservatism that documents the rise of what the author calls housewife populism, mostly in Southern California. We think of California today as just the bluest of blue states, but that was not the case in the mid-20th century and into the late 20th century, particularly in the southern part of the state. And these were women who came out of the World War II era, married, had small children, and were kind of living that quintessential American dream. And they were deeply terrified of communism. They were worried about progressive teachers in the public schools. And so they used things like school boards and local government bodies to enforce these conservative ideals. And we saw their work when they were opposing integration of public schools in the South and elsewhere. And I think we saw them very, very active in the Republican Party throughout the second half of the 20th century. One political historian said something along the lines of, women were largely responsible for defining and redefining the Republican Party throughout the second half of the 20th century. And there was this fight about what it means to be a Republican woman and what does Republican womanhood look like. And you had people like Barbara Bush, early Barbara Bush, and Margaret Chase Smith, who were close to the closest thing you have to a Republican feminist. So these were women who were, they were fiscally conservative. They had some libertarian ideals, but They supported things like birth control. They supported the Equal Rights Amendment for a while. And then during the 70s, with the rise of what's called the New Right, we started to see women like Phyllis Schlafly, and then women like the subject of the biography I just finished writing, who happen to have a place in the conservative media, which was pretty rare, rise up and kind of wrestle the conservative movement just farther and farther right. So it was not surprising to me that many white women voted for Trump in the last election, and I will be very interested to see what the voting demographics look like in 2020.
And if you look at Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, Amy Klobuchar, I thought your point was interesting about kind of to separate Hillary's gender from her Clintonism. Do you feel those three candidates could be different, could be more effective from a Democratic point of view? Or are they deliberately trying to redefine themselves as not Hillary Clinton?
So I don't have a tidy answer to that. I know I heard an early critique of Warren. It made me really mad, but I think in part because I recognized that it might be true in the eyes of some voters. I heard some concerns that she resembled Hillary Clinton too much, that her hair was too similar, that her style of dress was too similar, and that could be a liability for her. I don't necessarily think that's because I mean, a lot of white male politicians all look really similar too, so I don't know if that's really a fair critique. But I do think that there is some scrambling to define lanes. Now, the problem is there are so many candidates running, and there are a handful of really big personalities at the top of the ticket. Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden, and now Elizabeth Warren, increasingly, that I think it's going to be difficult for candidates to really carve out a lane and define themselves.
Ted, if I can just bring you into this, you went to college and law school in the 60s. You were here during busing in the 70s, lived through Reagan in the 80s, Clinton impeachment in the 90s. I mean, are we kind of wrong in saying this is the most polarized we've ever been? This is the worst it's ever been. I've never seen the country more divided. Or is this, in fact, kind of not great, but things that the country has gone through before, and should that shape our response politically, that the sky isn't necessarily falling, but that we've kind of come through this before and we will again?
I'm not feeling particularly comfortable about how we're going to come through this. I mentioned in our earlier class that it is of deep concern to me that within the course of about 48 hours, we have heard from a president who has basically taken the position that he and his administration are above the law. We spent a semester in this open classroom talking about the importance of the rule of law, particularly in a time of turmoil. And it is also the case that within the last 48 hours or so, we've heard that troops are going to be withdrawn from an area of the world where military conflict is going to be extended in a way that some folks are saying could lead to a genocide. And during those other periods of turmoil, whether during the Civil Rights era or the Vietnam era or subsequent to that, you didn't have the confluence of the essential implosion of a number of important democratic institutions at the same time that the conflict was going on. And so at that point in time, there were institutions that were available to help initiate some form of reconciliation or some form of balance. But now the institutions themselves have been discredited in ways that cause any portion of the imbalance to really skew in ways that were not the case in the 60s and the 70s. And while certainly there were construction workers, for example, who attacked anti-war demonstrators, and certainly while there were parents in a number of places, not just in Boston, but around the country, who resisted school segregation or who resisted school integration for their children, there was always a sense that the courts or the churches or other institutions in the society would step forward to try to mitigate and offset that kind of polarization. And at this moment, and we talked about this a bit in the class, it's hard to ascertain which of our institutions, whether in the public sector or the private sector, are now going to step forward to provide a kind of not just platform, but leadership in terms of trying to reconcile differing points of view.
Let me go through one more round, and then we'll open it up for questions. Margaret, I as a law professor, I'd asked you to talk as a political analyst, but now I want you to go back to being a law professor. With impeachment, obviously, we've entered a moment now where it looks like this is going to end up in the courts one way or another. Congress is asking for things, it's subpoenaing things, Trump is saying no, and much as in 74, it looks like when Nixon kind of refused to hand over the tapes, this will end up in the Supreme Court. Can you talk a little bit about how you think, separate from the politics of this, the legal aspect of impeachment may play out, but then also what that means to kind of Ted's point about are the courts and the Supreme Court self-confident enough institutions, nimble enough institutions to get us through this the same way that 8-0 Supreme Court decision that made Trump turn over the tapes was kind of a dam, Nixon, that was a dam that kind of, finally began to bring an end to Watergate.
I do think that, so your question essentially is, will the rule of law hold through this impeachment proceeding as it did in the past? Your question essentially is, will the rule of law hold? And I agree. I'm with Ted on this. I think that we're at a crossroads where the future is not that easy to predict. Which is not to say that we've not been at this crossroads many times before in our country, and we've come through. Whether we come through this time, I think really is up for grabs. And I say that because you mentioned the Supreme Court, and of course that's where the buck will ultimately stop. I do think that Trump's resistance to Congress will be rejected by the lower courts. I think it will be rejected at the first level, and I think it will be rejected ultimately at the Court of Appeals. I cannot say what will happen when and if the matter gets to the Supreme Court. All the legal commentary that has been generated in the last week essentially makes quite clear that he is completely has no right at all, no constitutional right at all to stonewall the Congress as he has been and says he intends to do throughout. What is interesting is that this will come to the courts at a much earlier moment, and you ask whether the courts can be nimble enough. It will come to the courts with some urgency. So that I think we'll learn really quite quickly how the lower courts and the Court of Appeals are going to respond. to the failure to respond to requests for documents and subpoenas. And I should also say, let's leave it at that.
I mean, Ben, I know you said it's hard to tell what impact impeachment's going to have, but based on your relationships and conversations with the 12, the people in Luzerne, I mean, how do you think they're going to process impeachment? Will it just fuel their sense of alienation and our guy right or wrong? Or is there a tipping point where people begin to say, no, this is more than I can bear, even if I am sort of angry at the Democrats or angry at the elites? You have a great line. I really recommend the book to people. And at the end, there's a great image where one of these Trump voters says, people like their therapists, and Trump was like our therapist. We felt like he was listening to us. And I'm kind of wondering if at this point they'll say they need a new therapist or if they're going to stick with it.
Well, my 12 were pretty hardcore, and you know, as I said in the class, the Trump's famous line from the campaign about how he could walk down Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody still rings very true to me. And for some people, it's become a cult. There's just nothing that this guy can do that they won't support. But it's been really interesting to see in the last few weeks since the impeachment inquiry got underway, the polls are shifting rapidly in favor of impeachment. And, you know, while the conventional wisdom is that the House will impeach, as I think certainly will, the Senate will acquit. But that could change, I think, because if the polls rise up to say 60% in favor of impeachment, that'll give some of these, you know, old bucks in the Senate cover, and it could change. But things are just moving very, very rapidly, and I think that you know, the politics of this are a variable. Nancy Pelosi was holding off as long as she could, and because she thought that this would create a backlash and help Trump win. Now I don't think anybody is so sure. I think the House was right to stand up for its rights, and they couldn't remain silent in the face of this massive stonewalling that's been going on for years, since the Mueller investigation. And I think we don't know what how the politics of this are going to play out. It depends, I guess, on how much more incriminating evidence is uncovered.
Meg, could you talk about the media's role in all this? I mean, when the history of this period is written, is the media going to be seen as blind to it, culpable in it, or kind of getting its act together and trying to kind of reassert some role, as Ted suggests, of kind of, you know, interposing itself or playing some sort of a watchdog role again?
I think it's going to be difficult, at least in the short term, to define any cohesive narrative about what the media did and did not do, because the modern media landscape is so fragmented. I see pockets of utter brilliance, just really great journalism at organizations big and small, where there's fact checking, there's holding people accountable, there's using narrative and data and just good stories to try and bring people together, and do all the things that those of us who go into journalism like to think that we can do in service to the communities that we cover and civic life. And at the same time, I see a lot of really, really problematic coverage also. And the tendency to just focus far too much on the horse race and far too much on national messaging and not just giving time for the candidates to go out and meet voters and voters to make up their minds. I do think that political scientists will have a lot to chew on about this election cycle because of the front loading of the Democratic debates. You know, we've had campaigns end more, you know, almost a year before the New Hampshire primary because they couldn't get enough traction to get on the stage and be part of the national debate. And I don't know if, and you know, like I said, I worked for a long time in New Hampshire. I don't necessarily think that New Hampshire and Iowa should go first. They just do. And so I operate in a landscape in which they do go first. And I wonder what their role is going to be going forward and how this focus on early debates is going to change the narratives around the campaigns. Excuse me.
Okay, so we're now going to open it up for questions. Brandy's going to go around, but I'm going to take the privilege of the panel, and I'm going to put Barry Bluestone on the spot. And I'd like him to talk to us a little bit. 4 or 5 years ago, you gave a famous presentation in this classroom a couple of months before the election that predicted that Donald Trump would win and why. And this has been, it's sort of like, you know, one of these samizdat things that get passed around now, looking at that. And I'm kind of wondering if we had to ask you the same question now about Trump versus whoever, what would your analysis be, and how would you parse the election now?
Jonathan, thanks for that question. In September of 2016, just 2 months before the election, I indeed predicted that Trump had a very good chance of winning the election, despite every poll suggesting that Hillary was going to sweep the country. And I think the reason goes back to two things. One, I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. I grew up in Michigan, and I still go back, and I was listening to what was happening in Michigan. Number two, my late and dear colleague, Bennett Harrison, and I wrote a book back in 1982 called The Deindustrialization of America, or Capital versus Community. And I saw that more and more workers, white and black, but particularly white, were downwardly mobile as they were losing jobs in automobiles, steel, tire industry, and so forth. And these are concentrated, of course, in Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. We followed that book up in 1988 with a book called The Great U-Turn, Corporate Restructuring and the Polarizing of America. And that book talked about, we did a lot of statistical analysis, and we began seeing the rapid rise in inequality beginning around 1973, after a period of time in which inequality, well, wages were rising, family incomes were rising, inequality is declining, from the end of World War II through 73, and now for at least another almost 15 years had been rising. Very early indications of what has happened ever since. And I remember in that lecture, right in this room when I was running the open classroom, I said I was very proud of the fact that my late colleague Ben Harris and I understood deindustrialization. I was very proud of the fact that we understood the growing inequality. But I wish we weren't economists. I wish we were political scientists or historians, because we completely missed the political implications of growing inequality and of people feeling dispossessed, as you write about, or forgotten, the title of your book, Ben. We really missed that. So now when I look at this election, I'm wondering, just as Margaret pointed out, are the candidates in the Democratic Party going to connect with working families, particularly in the Midwest, many of them white workers who feel they've lost, the America that they had grown up with. This fact in this little video that only 31% of white young people, 20 to 34, believe their lives will be better than their parents. I'm worried about that. And so I wonder, most importantly, Can Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, Amy, Pete, can they connect with those disenfranchised voters? Not the extreme 12 or 11 of the 12 that Ben talks about, but those who voted for Trump, voted for Obama before that. Can we win them back, particularly in those 4 or 5 states? I think the answer is yes, but I think each of the Democratic candidates has to be very careful and out front of getting into those states, which Hillary did not do at the end of the campaign, and convince those disenfranchised people, white, black, Hispanic, that a Democratic candidate, if elected, will really improve their lives, because the facts are Trump has not. I wish I knew. I have been predicting for a long time that Trump would not make it through the 2020 election. In fact, I said there was a chance in one lecture, the last lecture I gave at the open classroom, that he could be gone by June of this year. I'm a little premature. We'll see what happens. I am right now, honestly, supporting Joe Biden because I think he has the best chance of winning against Trump. And I think the reason why Trump and all of his minions have been attacking Biden more than anyone else is they're most afraid of him.
Well, thank you for the panel discussion. I had a contractor do some work at my house about a year ago, and do a number of Italian contractors, which I think represents a very worrisome group of people. They're not educated, but they're reasonably well off. And one of the contractors he said to me that, he really liked Mussolini. And then he said, well, because I said that, will you still let me do the work? And I said I would, but I'm concerned about how many people in the country who really believe in democracy, and whether this person represents a hidden group that we all have to worry about.
Who wants to take on the rise of authoritarianism in America?
Well, I think it's not just authoritarianism. It's what you're talking about is proto-fascism. And I think one thing we now know is that we always thought that that we were immune to the factors that mobilize fascism in other countries, and we know now that neither our country nor the UK nor any other longstanding democracy is immune from the kind of populism that gives rise to authoritarianism and fascism. I think that's all I want to say is that, yes, we're on a precipice. We are on a precipice of that, and we need to recognize that, which is all. I think that's what I want to say.
Well, I'm worried about what you suggest, and Trump plainly has dictator envy. He'll say to Kim Jong-un, Jesus, I wish I could do what you did in your country, or, just how easy it is being a dictator and how democracy gets in the way. But he's plainly trampled on the rule of law in this country. He treats the Justice Department as his personal law firm rather than representing the country. And his supporters get the message.
If the events that have taken place over the last few months that have had the effect of undermining the rule of law or our belief in the rule of law were taking place anywhere else in the world, we would be deeply concerned, and we would be thinking that democratic nations needed to intervene in order to find ways of supporting democracies in those countries where it appeared that the rule of law was in fact being undermined. So now we have to address that strategically and tactically in our country. And part of the challenge that we face, and this showed up in some NPR interviews this morning, is that throughout the country, there are individuals such as the person you make reference to who basically said that they don't care about what's going on in politics at this moment, as long as Supreme Court appointments and certain social issues such as abortion and right to life are dealt with in ways that are consistent with their belief systems. So people are open in saying that the undermining of democratic institutions is okay as long as they get what they want. And I think those of us who live in this kind of progressive New England bubble need to hear those voices clearly, as you did in Pennsylvania, and then engage in the ways that we have historically engaged. Much of the civil rights movement took place because people from New England decided to go on freedom rides and to express their sense of conscience concerning what else was going on in the country. Much of what has happened at other moments of division have taken place because individuals with liberal or progressive values have stepped up and have said it's important for us to try to be persuasive to the rest of the country of values that are better to maintain long-term unity in the country, even if we have disagreements. And clearly, we're at that moment. I think that we're at a point where we need to apply to ourselves the same set of rules that we would wish were being applied in countries around the world.
Margaret, let me ask you, and Ben has also spent time in South Africa. When you went to South Africa to begin work on what became Truth and Reconciliation, that was in a way the most difficult conversation for South Africans to have. Are there any, if not lessons from that, but, how do we begin those conversations? I was encouraged when you said, when the contractor said, I like Mussolini, can I still work for you? You said yes, right? Because a lot of people might say, no, you can't. I'm going to find someone I agree with. There's more and more evidence now that people are choosing their tenants and their boyfriends and girlfriends, and people can barely get through Thanksgiving with people who disagree with them. So I'm wondering, maybe South Africa is a good example, maybe it's not, maybe your work on civil rights and restorative justice is a better example. I mean, how do you have difficult conversations in this country at this moment?
Well, let me just say again that we have been talking both to each other and past each other for many years in this country. And our best angels are when we are talking to each other. And there are many examples of that. I mean, this is not new ground. This is fertile ground. Ted mentioned the civil rights movement, but, this is 2019 is the anniversary of the campaign that brought the vote that enlarged our democracy by bringing the vote to women. Those were campaigns that were united across lines of race and political difference, and obviously the demise of the union movement has a huge effect, as my friend here says, has a huge effect. The deindustrialization of the country, and with it the demise of the union movement, has a huge effect on opportunities for cross-racial, cross-religious collaboration, cooperation, organizing, strategizing in order to understand where our common interests lie and working on them. But in every setting, there are those opportunities in our workplaces, in our classrooms, in our religious communities. There are opportunities for talking to people who think differently. It is also true, as Meg suggests, that the stratification of the media has made those opportunities, has reduced those opportunities because we tend to only listen to MSNBC or to Fox News, and therefore you only sort of hear one point of view. But I think it is our obligation to reach out and expand those opportunities. Certainly, yeah, South Africa, done with great difficulty in South Africa. In part, the South African story turns on Nelson Mandela, but it also turns on those who were in his orbit, who were part of what he saw as one South Africa. That essentially was an utterly amazing phenomenon, that he was able to bring people to the bargaining table under the banner of "We are all South Africans." It's kind of what we need in our country. And then we can find about what it means for us all to be Americans and what it really means to make America great again.
Well, the South African model that you suggest is fascinating to me. I spent most of the year 1985 there for the Globe at the height of the Troubles. And, of course, I was fascinated by the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which fulfills such an important social and political function in that country. That was instituted, of course, after the change of the regime and a whole new form of dispensation and government. I sort of wonder out loud whether a Truth and Reconciliation Commission model could work here, but the circumstances are different. We haven't overthrown apartheid, but it's interesting to speculate. Do you see any sort of mini TRC model that might work here organizationally?
So two things. Number one, the South African transformation, and that in a number of other number of other states that have experienced conflict. Scholars talk about transitional justice, and what we mean by that are states that are moving from immediate conflict to a space where everyone has got to get along if the country is going to survive. And that's where South Africa was. That's where many of the Latin American states were in the 1980s and 1990s. What we say about the United States and other countries like the United States is that we're in a transition, but it's a very, very long transition. And we haven't actually, and we haven't even recognized that we're still transitioning from a state of non-democracy. Talk about authoritarianism. Let's take a look at the South in the 1930s and 1940s if you want to talk about authoritarianism. Authoritarianism is not unique to foreign countries, right? So we are in a far longer transition, and the question is whether or not a TRC would have to be something where the state has some buy-in, where it has some organizing authority. It can't be a private TRC. And do I see that coming? Let's get through the next election first.
Meg, can we apply the Me Too model to this? I mean, obviously, Me Too has started a lot of intense conversations at every level of society, universities, schools, businesses, politics. Is there something in there that's hopeful that we have learned how to have difficult conversations, or is it, as Margaret suggests, kind of something aborting, but we're not there yet?
I think, unfortunately, we're not there yet. But I do really like, Margaret, how you just framed the idea of a very long transition. It's a little glimmer of hope. And I think that is, I think that's where we're at. The Me Too movement, the modern incarnation of the Me Too movement is the second incarnation of the Me Too movement. The phrase Me Too, to identify oneself as a survivor of sexual misconduct, predated the existence of hashtags and dates back to an activist in 2006 and six-ish. And so I think we're seeing a refocusing on on the problem of gendered harassment, sexual misconduct. But just an example of how far we still have to come. There are a lot of debates going on online about the truth in a story that Elizabeth Warren often tells on the Stump, where she talks about how she was a school teacher very early in her career, and she talks about how she was asked not to return for a second year when she became visibly pregnant. And there was a lot of skepticism about that claim. And, she's told the story a little differently over the years. And there's certainly nothing wrong with fact-checking and contextualizing stories that candidates tell on the Stump. But I think what has really bothered me is just the inability of many people to believe that pregnancy discrimination existed then and still exists now. And just this idea that there are lots of different types of gendered harassment and gender discrimination that exist. So I think we've got a long way to go. I do think the fact that there are multiple women running for office is forcing the issue, and I just hope that we can, as an electorate and as journalists, do what Margaret was talking about earlier, that idea of being able to talk about those things while still also talking about issues that affect absolutely everybody, like healthcare and employment and all of those fundamental things.
Questions from the audience?
We've been talking about gender issues and equality, and we had a person come earlier this session and talk about, well, you have to lower your voice and you have to do a few other things that seem to me pretty much you have to act like a man in order to get yourself elected. And I wonder what you all think about that.
I think it's interesting, this question of how, and I think Elizabeth Warren has become a test case for this, which is that, in the end, candidates start out one way and end up another. I covered Obama, for example, and, Obama went through this transition. He was a much better candidate by the end, but he also, I think, understood in his role the need not to scare white people. I think it was very clear that he had to somehow become a bridge that would make whites comfortable with the change that was coming. And even things like introducing Michelle Obama into the campaign and focusing on his family and the kids, I think there'll be a lot of interesting history written about how he positioned himself and why. And so I think when you're having a transition, I think this is one of the tensions that's always there, which is, how do you move along the folks in Luzerne, Pennsylvania, or if not the 12, the other 88 maybe who are more, open to persuasion, and is that considered, betraying your base or betraying some fundamental philosophy? And I think that Elizabeth Warren is clearly going through that in how she presents herself. And I think one of the things that was a question with female candidates, with African-American candidates, and I'm sure will be with Latino candidates. I think it's been true with Jewish candidates in the past. There is a kind of mainstreaming that has to take place. I'm not sure if that's good or bad, but, I think Obama showed that there's a way you can succeed and still be authentic, although I think there was criticism of him even when he was running by African-Americans who said, he's not being authentic enough. And I think it's tied in a little bit with the political issue, which is if you believe in Medicare for all, if you believe in certain things like that, where do you have to moderate your views? What's amazing about Trump is I'm not sure he has any views. We've heard that several times on the panel. Clearly immigration is a view of his. but he has no problem kind of changing his spots and kind of believing that he can do all these things. And I think the Democrats could be getting themselves into a bind because they're kind of trying to win the primary, but then can they pivot, or will that just be used as an example that they're wishy-washy? But the style thing, I mean, this is something I think, Meg has looked at a lot, which is it somehow a betrayal or making things worse if Elizabeth Warren suddenly shows up at the Democratic National Convention dressing differently, talking differently, presenting a very different view of herself than maybe she showed even stylistically on the trail.
So the hard truth is that existing in any professional space or any public space is more complicated for anybody who is not the traditional image of that profession or of power. And in our culture, that tends to mean white, cis, straight men. And so anybody who branches from that or departs from that is going to have a little bit of a harder time navigating public spaces and professional spaces. And I wish that was not the case, but it is. And I do think that it is slowly getting better. And I will be interested to see, if a woman is the nominee or the running mate, how her image is managed, how that gets handled. And I know one of the things that really stuck out for me in the 2016 campaign or the 2016 Democratic convention was that Hillary Clinton wore white as a nod to suffrage. If you see, that's the suffragettes, the suffragists, they were all white. That was their thing. And so when she accepted the nomination, coming up on the 100th anniversary of suffrage, she wore all white. And so I thought that was a subtle, powerful nod and, a way to use women's fashion to her benefit. That was very core to her message. And I thought that's an example of how she was able to use the feminine in kind of a power move and in a way that amplified her message. On the flip side, we saw Sarah Palin do this really well in 2008. I mean, she had that rural, and she said this, I think a hockey mom, rural hockey mom thing down. And the political media loved it. She was a huge source of fascination and got a lot of really positive coverage because of her unusualness. So I do think it can be used strategically, but I think it's going to take a really savvy candidate and savvy handlers and strategists. And, the Democratic Party has done a good job of diversifying the people working on campaigns in the last few cycles. So I think that's going to play out too, and they'll leave their mark also.
And I think also you look at Pete Buttigieg, the first, openly gay candidate, and how he's presenting himself, as a veteran and all these things which kind of in a way maybe reassure people. But also I thought it was interesting that we had Joanna Weiss on a panel who's looked at spouses of candidates, and the most successful spouse is Buttigieg's husband. Who is doing it not by tweeting, policy statements, but by pictures of him with a dog, and kind of it's just a fascinating thing. But I think it's a very calculated attempt to kind of make people feel comfortable with what some people may find to be a change. Yeah.
So I'm pretty curious now, looking more at a global scale, why do you think it is that the United States is yet to elect a woman when we've seen so many countries in Europe do it?
I know. No, I think that's exactly right. And I think it gets back to what I was saying earlier, that white women have enforced that patriarchy and white supremacist versions of that patriarchy for a really, really long time, out of a perceived need for self-protection. So I think that has a lot to do with it. And I think just the American, like the mythology around America and Americana is very much a man's story. And even though the truth of it is not. I mean, women have been involved in all of the good things and all of the bad things in this country throughout its history. But I think our understanding of it is very male, and that makes it a lot harder. And I also wonder, and I am not a political scientist, but maybe someone up here can comment. I also wonder if the size of our country and the way that our presidential elections happen matters. And I don't know if that's a factor or not.
Ben, do you have any sense of that from the women you spoke to in Luzerne County, whether there's some backstory to this, or is it just that Hillary Clinton was the wrong candidate? Could they support Nikki Haley?
I think they're down for the patriarchy. Conservative women, I mean, as Meg said, it's true. They totally dismissed Trump's, the Access Hollywood tape, the 17 women on the record who stepped forward to say that he had sexually harassed them. Just didn't believe it, didn't want to believe it. And the Access Hollywood tape was, they picked right up on Trump's talking point explanation as locker room talk. And they would add, women talk that way too. So, different culture.
Okay, well.
And I would add one other thing. I think you're right about the size of the country affecting things. But it has also struck me that in other countries where women have risen to the top political slot, based on my observation, they are by and large machine candidates. That is to say, they didn't declare themselves to be the most likely person to rise to the top. There was always a machine around them, whether it was the Labor Party or the Conservative Party or the parties in India. And I think about how it was that the first African Americans and women came to be elected mayors in this country, whether in Chicago or New York, or when Tom Bradley was elected mayor of Los Angeles back in the late 60s. Invariably, they were candidates who had been supported by a local political machine, and the machine had said, it's your turn. And at that point, the existence of an electoral structure on the ground that could get someone elected cast up the candidate rather than the candidate self-declaring their appropriateness to be elected at that moment. And in the American top-level system, by and large, people self-declare. They may have been elected officials, but by and large, they're not necessarily backed by a political machine that says, you're the one this time, and we will support you. We will raise the money for you. We will put the troops on the ground to get you elected. We will do the PR that needs to be done. And we will protect you when the onslaught of negative criticism comes in your direction.
Okay, well, that's we're going to wrap it up now. Next week, we're going to be continuing the discussion of American divisions, looking at the media. There'll be someone here from Fox News, someone from National Public Radio, and probably a couple of others. So that should be a good session. I want to thank the panel for a really interesting discussion, and let's give them a round of applause. It's pretty stormy outside, I think, so drive safely, and then we can all put on the news as soon as we get home.